Good morning or afternoon or wherever you might be actually seeing this. It's a shame about the snow day, but we are going to learn today about the energy for your cells and how your cell uses and utilizes the different forms of energy to do the work and processes of the cell. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how energy drinks work and whether they should really be called energy drinks or something else. And so we are now moving on to chapter 6. This is the chapter on energy. Your Learn Smart will be due March 14th. So that's in the middle of spring break, but we need to get these Learn Smarts in at some stage. So hopefully you can make time to do that Learn Smart. The exam is on March 27th. It will be chapter 6, 7, and 8. So today we're going to define the various forms of energy. And we're really going to be concerning ourselves with the first and second laws of thermodynamics and how that dictates what your cells can and cannot do, and also how your cells use these to do these laws to do work in the cell. And then we're also going to talk about entropy or disorder and how that dictates the limitations of what your cell can and cannot do. And basically, the take-home message from entropy is that all things tend towards entropy. So all things are headed towards an entropic state, disorder. And that sort of in order to maintain order in your cell, you need to use energy to fight entropy. And then we're going to define energy in a biological context and explain what energy is used for in the cell. And then, like I said, we're going to finish with a little case study. Oh, also, we are going to finish today's lecture with some review for the lab exam on Thursday. So hopefully, even though we're not going to be able to go over this in class, you'll get a chance to sort of see what kind of questions I will be asking. Okay, so let's recall briefly. So we're going to touch back on the basic principles that we've developed up until now. And one of those is that life requires energy. What differentiates a rock from a bear is that a bear needs to continually acquire and use energy to continue to be alive, whereas a rock is just sitting there. And so what do we mean when we say life requires energy? What is energy? And so there you go. What is energy and why do we need it? I'm going to pause every now and again during this just to stimulate your thoughts. This is where normally we would have a little discussion. So what is energy? What is energy in a biological context, and why do we need it? Okay. So energy is the capacity to cause or do work. So there is potential energy, and there is kinetic energy. And you can think of this as, excuse me, potential energy is stored energy. It's energy that you can use but aren't currently using. Whereas kinetic energy is the use of energy to put something in motion, okay? And chemical energy is stored in bonds, and it's a type of potential energy. And this is the energy that is generally used by your cell to do work. So it takes this chemical energy and then does work, sort of uses the kinetic energy, uses this chemical energy to do kinetic work. And the way it does this is it transforms the chemical energy, this potential energy, into kinetic energy using metabolism. So what is the source of chemical energy in the cell? Can you think of any sources of energy in the cell? There are sort of long-term sources and there are short-term sources of chemical energy. So one of the basic currencies of the cell is ATP. And so we talked about how the phosphate bond of ATP is broken to then, you have your adenosine triphosphate, and when you want to do work in the cell, you break off one of those phosphates, and it's that breaking of that bond that releases the potential energy in that bond to do work. And so that's one of the sources of chemical energy. Similarly, if we look at glucose and fats and proteins, I said that they're a form of energy storage, right? So when you break those bonds, the glucose bonds, you are generating energy, which is then transferred generally into these ATP molecules. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But just that is what chemical energy is. It's just those bonds breaking to increase. Yeah, here, let's move on, shall we? Okay, so why do we need energy? Why do we, as a living organism, actually need energy? So on your right here, you will see the amount of calories, which is a biological measure of energy, that is needed to do various activities. Okay, so even just sitting, writing consumes energy. Whereas, for example, running, dancing consume a lot of energy. I don't know about you, but I can't run a 7-minute mile for an hour. But you can imagine that that's a fair amount of energy. And so on the other side of things, we get energy from the food that we eat. And so you can see the amount of calories that you would actually get from the various these various food sources. So not surprisingly, a cheeseburger or bean burrito has a lot of calories in it, whereas broccoli and garden salad, which are not as fat heavy, not sugar heavy, have much less calories. Okay? Okay, so kinetic versus potential energy. This is going to be very important as we go along, so we're going to work hard on trying to understand which is which. So here we have a roller coaster. When the people get to the top of the roller coaster, they are filled with potential energy. They're not necessarily moving, but they have a lot of potential to do work. Once they start going down the roller coaster, they are now starting to have the potential energy turning into kinetic energy. So that speed, that movement, that is kinetic energy. Then when they come back on the upslope of the roller coaster and they start going up the hill, they are gaining potential energy. Okay, so the further and further up they go, they are gaining potential energy. And so when we talk about the kinetic and potential energy of the cell, think of it as sort of going up and down slopes. So the ATP molecule is at the top of one of these slopes. It has a lot of energy that can be used. And breaking it releases energy and goes down this slope. Whereas when you then want to go and convert the adenosine diphosphate, so when it just has 2 phosphates, when you convert that back to ATP, you're going back up the slope. So you're gaining more potential energy to do work. Okay, so now we're going to watch a catchy but hilarious song about kinetic versus potential energy. And then we're going to work on a little table trying to differentiate which one is kinetic and which one is potential energy. Oop. Okay, fine. Sorry, guys. Let's just make sure that we're getting, yes, okay, good. So this is one of the confusing parts of this video, actually. When the rubber band actually has to be in motion, that is kinetic. Whereas when the stretch happens, that's potential. Potential. All right, hopefully everybody enjoyed that hilarious and catchy song, but let's start talking a little bit about what is kinetic and what is potential energy. So one question I think needs to be asked is, can something have both kinetic and potential energy? So think about this for a second. Can you think of any examples of when there might be an object has both kinetic, so it's moving, but still has potential energy? Okay. So one example that I always think of is a baseball. Okay. So you take a baseball and you throw it up in the air. So it is moving, but as it climbs and gets higher and higher up, it's still obtaining more potential energy. And then at some point, it's going to start heading downwards. And so it still has this kinetic energy. So it's still moving, but it still has more potential energy as it goes down. So things can have both kinetic and potential energy at the same time. So it's important to realize that they're not, an object does not have one or the other. Okay? Okay, so let's try and fill this out. A stretched rubber band, so it's not moving necessarily. It doesn't have kinetic or potential energy. So it has potential energy. It's not doing any work at that point in time, but it has the potential to do more energy. All right, rubber band shot at your little brother. So it is moving through the air. So it has kinetic energy. It arguably has a little bit of potential energy, but mainly it has kinetic energy. A can of gasoline that is just sitting on the ground, not doing anything, it's not moving. It has no actual kinetic energy, but it has a ton of potential energy. It can do a lot of different work if you wanted to light it on fire. Similarly, a burning log, the heat that's being released is kinetic energy. So it has kinetic energy. Now, it still has some potential energy. It's not until it's completely burnt out that it actually loses all of its potential energy. A bouncing basketball. So as you bounce a basketball, it has kinetic energy. Now, in my baseball example, when the baseball reaches the top of its arc, it still has potential energy. So a bouncing basketball also has some potential energy. All right? So these are the different forms of kinetic versus potential. Kinetic is movement. Potential is the potential to do work. All right. So there are 3 laws of thermodynamics, but in biology, we're really only going to be concerned with the first 2. So a basic way of thinking of thermodynamics is the first law is you can't win. The second law is you can't even break even. The third law is that even though you can't win or can't break even, you can't quit. So now we're going to talk about exactly what this means. So the first law of thermodynamics, you can't win. First law of thermodynamics states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The total energy remains the same, however, the form can change. So this is very important because it means that your cells can't actually make energy, they can only convert it. So even though I very frequently use the shorthand of your cells making energy, mitochondria making energy, what I really should be saying is your cells converting energy. And so the generally, the only way that we get energy is from the sun. The sun is a big burning source of potential and kinetic energy that chloroplasts in plant cells take the energy from the sun, and then they convert it using CO2 and H2O as reactants to make carbohydrates. Now, important here is that in taking the sun's energy and converting it to carbohydrates, these plant cells also release heat. And this is going to become important for the second law, in that when you do the conversion, you also lose some energy. Okay. So here's the basic idea of conversion of energy. So the solar energy comes from the sun. Plants convert this into chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates, releasing a small amount of heat in the process. In this case, a moose comes along and eats the stored chemical energy of the plant, and then can use that to convert it into mechanical energy. So this is sort of the flow of the solar energy gives the plant energy, which it then converts into chemical energy, which then a moose or yourself can use as mechanical energy. So all of our energy basically starts most of our energy, 99.9% of our energy, starts with the sun. Okay? So this comes now to the second law of thermodynamics. You can't break even. So all these conversions are not perfect. Okay? So when we convert energy, when energy is converted, the usable energy decreases. So the amount of energy that comes from the sun that is converted into chemical energy by this plant, some of it is lost through heat. It spontaneously just, whenever you convert energy, you're going to lose some of it to the unusable form, heat. So this, you can feel this in your own muscle. So when you go for a run or you lift weights or just try and lift something heavy, your body starts warming up and you start releasing heat. And this is your muscles trying to convert the chemical energy of ATP into mechanical energy. But in that conversion, there's heat that's lost. And so this heat needs to be sort of dealt with in your body, and that it just dissipates into the environment. Okay, so you have your carbohydrates. In this case, actually, they're then converted into ATP, and then your muscle contracts, and in the contraction, it converts the chemical energy into kinetic energy of the contraction doing the work. But in that conversion, you lose heat. And this also happens for plants when they convert the sun energy into chemical energy. Some of the energy is lost through heat. So this heat and this so why are we interested in energy? One of the reasons is that all things in the universe, this is another law, proceed towards disorder and randomness. So what makes this energy more or less usable is entropy. So disorder, so the general just sort of disorder or entropy is energetically favorable. So you want there's a drive for things to be more spread out, more dispersed, and more diffuse. And so really what we do in biology is we're fighting against entropy. We're trying to keep things organized when in fact they have a tendency towards disorganization or entropy. And so the amount of disorder in a system is known as entropy. So the idea is that in this particular diagram that if you have some collection of molecules in the center here, they will disperse across the actual away from each other towards a more entropic or more entropically favorable state. And so one of the examples we talked about previously is diffusion. This is an example of entropy driving a chemical process. So when you take your crystal dye and you put it into this water solution, there is sort of order in the system. So you have all of these molecules that are ordered over here that then want to be diffused. So they want to become more entropic. They want to become more equally distributed. So this diffusion is entropy. You start with this ordered state, and by the end you have a less ordered state. And this is more entropically favorable. So this is an example of how entropy drives these chemical processes that dictate your biology. So entropy is more favorable. Higher entropy is more favorable than lower entropy. So more disorder is favored over less disorder. And so in order to maintain order, you have to constantly be using energy to fight entropy. And so as usable energy decreases, unusable energy increases. So entropy increases. So in order to fight entropy, you end up losing more energy in the form of heat. And so heat is sort of a entropically favored version. So think about your cells themselves, right? They have this cellular membrane, which inside you have a certain number of molecules that are in disequilibrium with the outside. You have far more nucleic acids in the middle of your cell than you do anywhere else in your body. So this is highly entropically unfavorable, but your cells maintain this balance by constantly using and regenerating energy to sort of sacrifice at the altar of entropy. Okay? So active transport is actually just fighting against entropy. So you have a situation where you have more of a particular molecule on the inside of a cell and less on the outside. So entropically, you would want there to be an equal number of these molecules on both sides of the cell. But you can fight against this by breaking a bond of ATP. So you're actually sacrificing the entropy of ATP to change the entropy of this equilibrium. So by breaking a chemical bond, you're lowering, you're making the breaking of the ATP bond is entropically favorable, more so than the switching of these molecules from the outside to the inside. Okay. Similarly, osmotic pressure is driven by entropy. So it is entropically favorable if there's the same amount of H2O relative to solute on both sides of the cell. But if you get into a disequilibrium, entropy is going to drive the H2O into the cell. So all these chemical reactions that we talked about is driven by the drive of chemicals to be more entropic, more disordered. Okay? And you can use various forms of entropy to change, to sort of, so the use of ATP is you're decreasing the entropy of, you're increasing the entropy of this ATP molecule by breaking this bond, so that's to then decrease the entropy of these molecules. And so you're constantly in this fight against entropy as a biological system. Okay, so how does this work on a metabolic level? So the idea is that if you break a bond, you increase entropy. So right here, so you have glucose, right, which is has very low level of entropy, right? There's a lot of order in this particular molecule. You know, all these molecules have been like formed into one molecule. But when you break those bonds, you increase the entropy of the system. So you now have more molecules than you did previously. And so by breaking those bonds, you've increased the entropy, and that releases energy. Okay? And so when we talk about converting glucose to ATP, what we're doing is we're breaking these bonds, increasing the entropy of the glucose, and then putting that energy into bonds of ATP. Okay? So glucose is more organized, has more potential energy, and is less stable. And then by breaking those bonds, by increasing entropy, we've lost the potential energy of those bonds. It's less organized but more stable entropically, and we've taken that energy and converted it into ATP. So you can break a bond, you can increase entropy and release energy. Allow ions to flow down a gradient, and that will also release energy. So here's an example of we're going to talk more about the roles of mitochondria. And what they do is this state where you have a lot of ions on one side of a membrane is entropically unfavorable. But if you allow them to flow down this gradient, so high to low concentration, you can actually use the energy that generates to generate energy. And the way this works is that you transfer this energy that is caused by the flowing down a gradient to create phosphate bonds on ATP. And then you can break those phosphate bonds, so phosphate bonds being ATP, to release energy. So this is how the mitochondria create usable ATP energy from glucose. Believe it or not, we're going to talk about this later, but the breaking of glucose bonds drives a entropically unfavorable hydrogen ion gradient, which is then used to make energy. Okay, trust me, this will be complicated, but just realize that that's how this works. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more in detail of how ATP acts on the energy currency in this cell. All right, so this is an adenosine triphosphate. You have your three phosphates connected to this adenosine molecule, which is a sugar attached to, anyways, it doesn't matter. The three phosphates are what we're interested in. So this is adenosine triphosphate. So when you break that bond, you release energy. So you've now increased the entropy by breaking this bond. So you've taken this potential energy and broken it off to release energy. So this is triphosphate, this is diphosphate. So you've broken this bond. You've released the potential energy, and that releases energy to do work. So then the next step is in your cell is to recharge this molecule. You add the phosphate back on. And so this is respiration. This is cellular respiration. It's adding phosphate bonds onto ATP so that you can continue to do work in your body. And so this goes back to this reaction. By breaking these bonds, increasing entropy, you can then feed that energy into creating ATP molecules from ADP molecules. And that is the metabolism of your cell. That is the basic energy conversion. Is you take glucose, break those bonds, feed that energy into creating bonds between these phosphates, which can then be used by your various cellular processes to do work. Okay? Okay, so the energy flow of your this is more ecosystem wide. So you have energy input, which is then used by producers, so plants and other organisms, to make energy. This is then consumed by animals, fungi, bacteria, to use in their day-to-day life. So when we eat a plant, we're using the energy that they have taken from the sunlight to power our own cells. And generally, the energy flows down. So as we start up here, there's a lot of energy, a lot of potential and chemical energy, a lot of potential energy up here. But as we sort of flow down this gradient, the amount of energy that's actually available for use, for work, becomes less and less and less. And so the loss of this is mainly through heat. So this is the increase of entropy. By using energy, we lose energy through heat, which increases entropy, but is not useful for what we need to do. Okay, so the question then is, most of our energy says mainly, energy input mainly comes from sunlight. Can anyone think of an energy input that didn't start as sunlight? Okay, so when you think about this, you're like, oh, gasoline, oil. Like, no, that actually started off as plants. Those were originally algae that then became sort of fossilized and converted into hydrocarbons. So all gasoline is a bunch of long strings of carbon that we then, whose bond we then breaks and burn. So gasoline actually originally began as sunlight. So what is an example of energy that didn't begin as sunlight? You want to think of anything? Geothermal, right? So this is energy from the center of our Earth, which is then heat and magma, which is then comes to the surface. And so there are a number of organisms that live. So the geothermal vents of Yosemite, of Yellowstone, where you have these sort of like large pools of bacteria that live in these sort of warm vents, that energy that they're using from those vents comes from the Earth, so geothermal. So that's an example of the energy that doesn't come from sunlight. But most of our energy comes from sunlight. Okay, so the energy flow of the cell. Here's sort of an example of comparing a car to our cell. So you have a fuel. So you have this gasoline that has a lot of potential energy. You combine it with oxygen. And then that is converted into kinetic energy that allows the car to move. However, as you know, your cars then lose some of that energy in the form of heat. So this is the conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy and the loss of energy in the conversion. And then you end up with these waste products of carbon dioxide and water. Notice how the gasoline has a high, it has a lot of potential energy and a low level of entropy. So it's less disordered than these carbon dioxide molecules. So you've now increased entropy, released potential energy to do your work. So this is how the cell works. Your cell is basically acting like a car. You have your glucose, which is like your gasoline. You combine it with oxygen, and then your cells use this to do their work. So they use, similar to combustion being used to convert to kinetic energy, respiration converts that energy into cellular work in the form of ATP. You then lose some of that through heat energy, You increase entropy from the sort of ordered state, so you increase disorder relative to the glucose, and then you can do work. And you can maintain the homeostasis of your cell. You can use this energy to maintain what your cell is doing in exchange for the sort of increase in overall entropy of the system, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Okay, so what is energy used for in the cell? What are some examples of what your cell might need to use energy for? I'm going to give you a second to think about this. What does your cell need to do? Think of all the different processes it needs to do. So where we do think pair share, but we can't do that. Oh well. So there are three types of work that your cell needs to do. It's chemical work, so enzymes, so converting various metabolites to useful components of your cell, and we're going to talk a little bit more about enzymes on Thursday. There's mechanical work, so moving things around the cell requires energy. So you can use this ATP molecule, I should use my mouse, you can use this ATP molecule to move things around your cell. Then this will still release the energy in the form of breaking of a bond. Also, we just talked about transport. So you can transport solutes from one side of the membrane to the other by the release of these phosphate groups. So these are the different ways that energy is used in the cell. So any of the functions of your cell require energy. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a short case study of what is and is not an energy drink. So have you ever had an energy drink? Has anyone here had Red Bull or Rockstar or Monster or whatever? What do you generally feel after you have an energy drink? You feel sort of awake, stimulated, and ready to, take on the world, or whatever their particular slogan is at the moment. But is it really energy that you're getting from these in terms of a biological question? So Red Bull is a functional product developed especially for your periods of increased mental and physical exertion. It has been shown to improve performance, especially during times of increased stress or strain. And what it does is it claims that it stimulates your metabolism. And so what differentiates these from just like a soda is that they claim they have components that will actually sort of give you energy. It's not just that they have sugar; they have energy in them. For example, 5-hour energy, right? They say that they have developed this from various stimulants that are found in everyday foods like broccoli and avocado, bananas, apples. But it contains 0 sugar and only 4 calories. So the question then is this really, in a biological sense, energy? Because what your cell uses is sugars and calories to do work, and that's energy. So energy, even though they call themselves 5-hour energy, they don't actually have sugar in them. They do have other substances in them, however. Okay. So when you think of getting energy from food, what do you look at on the nutritional labels? You look at calories. So this is a direct measure of how much energy is in a particular foodstuff to do work. So when you look at the different stimulants, you have Red Bull has 110 calories. The low-carb Monster drinks have 20 calories, whereas 5-hour energy only has 4 calories, whereas Coca-Cola actually has 140 calories. So they have some some energy in them to do work, but it's really not as much as Coca-Cola. But what they do contain is a lot of stimulants. So what do these drinks actually give you energy? What is it that your cell actually uses for energy? Right? It's calories give you energy. And what is the biological definition of energy? It's the ability to do work. You can't do work from stimulants. You can only do work from breaking bonds, from taking chemical bonds and breaking them. In nature, we get these this energy from carbohydrates, from fats, from proteins. Minerals and vitamins help do the work, help release energy, but they don't actually have energy themselves. And so what do these ingredients actually do in the body, and do they actually provide energy? So one of the classic examples, so when we look at the, let's look at the ingredients of Red Bull. So you have which of these can actually be used by your body for energy? Carbonated water. So water is a very stable molecule. It's very hard to release energy from the bonds. But sucrose and glucose. What do we know about sucrose and glucose? Right? They're carbohydrates. They're sugars. Your body is very good at using those for energy. So there are two examples of molecules that can be used for energy. Sodium citrate, that's not something that you can use for energy. That's not something your body uses for energy. Taurine, gluconololactone, you cannot use it. Caffeine, we talk about that as giving you energy. Does it? We'll talk about this. Inosine, niacin, blah, 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 vitamin B12, artificial flavors, and colors. Which of these can actually give you energy? The only two that really can give you energy are sucrose and glucose. The rest are just stimulants. They can just stimulate you to do things. You feel more awake. They can't actually give you energy to do anything. So does caffeine give you energy? This is a caffeine molecule. The quick answer is that no, caffeine cannot give you energy. It's a stimulant, not a source of energy. It increases heart rate. It stimulates your heart and blood pressure. It improves alertness and reaction time. And some of these energy drinks can contain 80 milligrams of caffeine. I think this is actually a gross underestimate. I think some of these actually have a lot more than that. Some of these have crazy stimulants like ephedrine and taurine and guarana and ginseng, which stimulate, but they don't actually give you energy. They just stimulate your cells to release energy. So what should we actually call energy drinks? So when we look at Red Bull, we look at the nutritional information, the only part of Red Bull that is actually that can be used for energy is these sugars, and this tiny amount of protein, which is really not a lot of protein. And really this sugar is no different than what you would get from just a regular Coke. So they're not really energy drinks. And they're not really giving you sort of the nutritional energy that you need to do work. They just have a little bit of stimulants and a lot of sugar. So really, we should just call them stimulant drinks or sugar drinks. They're just sugar drinks. Whereas, maybe 5-hour energy is just a stimulant. Okay, so we're going to use a couple of quick examples of the questions that you can expect on the exam on Thursday. So we are talking about the scientific method. And this is the basic flow that we're talking about. You observe something. You observe something in nature. You ask a question. You form a hypothesis. You test your hypothesis using a test and control. So you have to properly format your experiment so that you have something you're testing and something you're comparing to. You then, based on this test and control, you confirm or reject your hypothesis. And you can then continue in this flow of testing your hypothesis, rejecting it, reformulating based off of this question. Okay? So here's an example. You observe a small fish near the shore and larger fish further out of the shore when you're on the ocean. So you need to formulate a question from this. So what is a question you would ask based off this something you observe? So this is this first step. You observe something. The question is, well, do fish, small fish, like to live near the shore? Is that part of their lifestyle, or was it just a one-off observation? So then you ask the question: do fish need to live? Small fish tend to live near the shore rather than further out? Without asking that question, it's just an observation. Okay. So the next thing is, having asked a question, you need to then formulate a hypothesis. So how fast are slugs and snails? You can develop a hypothesis to test this question. So what would be a hypothesis? My hypothesis is that snails move faster than slugs. Now you need to test it. So having developed a hypothesis, so you make an observation, you ask a question, how fast are slugs and snails, but that's not a hypothesis. There's no question. There's nothing that you can test in this question. How? You need to then develop a hypothesis. Slugs are faster than snails. Okay? Okay, so then now you have a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is that sloths move faster than slugs. I do love myself some sloths. develop an experiment to test this hypothesis. So now that you have a hypothesis that slugs move faster than slugs, that sloths move faster than slugs, you then need to be able to test this hypothesis. So without the ability to test a hypothesis, it's not a hypothesis, it's just a question. And in developing and in testing your hypothesis, you need to outline the test and control. So for me, I would, if my hypothesis was that sloths move faster than slugs, I would take a sloth and a slug, and I would see how fast they can move from point A to point B. I would test the rate of movement from point A to point B. Question, is one observation enough? If, like, for example, let's say you took a sloth and a slug and you measured how fast they move from point A to point B, but as the sloth was moving from point A to point B, a hawk came down, grabbed it, and ate it. Now, that slug moved from point A to point B faster than the sloth. Does that mean you can conclude that slugs move faster than sloths? No. That's why you need to test multiple different sloths and slugs when you do any kind of hypothesis testing. So you need multiple measurements to be confident in your that your experimental measurements are accurate. Okay. So the next thing I will ask you to do is to do some basic statistics. So if you have 6 sloths that you measured over a distance, and what you're going to need to be able to do is calculate the mean speeds of the sloths and the snails, and know how to calculate the mean. The other thing I'm going to have you calculate is the variance. Variance seems complicated, but it's not. So you calculate the mean of the rates that they move. Then what you do is you subtract the mean from each measurement and sum the square of that. So, if you, let's say, I don't know what the actual mean is there. So let's say the mean of the sloths equals 12. Okay. So then what you do is be 10 minus 12 to the power of 2, right? And you add 11. Sorry, this is a new computer for me. 11 minus 12 power of 2. You just do that for all of them, and then you divide it by the total number of sloths minus 1. So in this case, it would be 5. That's how you calculate variance. I'm not going to ask you to actually calculate it, but I want you to at least show me that you know how to calculate the variance. Okay. All right. So, having measured this, what would your data have to look like to accept or reject your hypothesis that sloths move faster than snails? One of the things I will probably ask you to do is plot something. So I'll have you properly label the x and y axes and the actual plot yourself from data that you will generate during the exam. Okay? So you need to know how you accept or reject a hypothesis. Yeah, so plot the mean speeds of sloths and snails. All right, but on top of this, I'm going to have one question where I'm going to have you go through the entire process. I have you start with an observation of some sort. So in this case, start with the observation that black cars drive faster. And I want you to follow through the entire process, developing a hypothesis, explaining your experimental design, and then telling me exactly what the data would have to look like to accept or reject the hypothesis. So what you would expect if the hypothesis was rejected or accepted. So this is an example of following all the way through the scientific method. Also, you need to know the metric system. It is a travesty that this country doesn't just do the metric system as standard, but you need to know these conversions. So how many microliters in a milliliter? So a microliter is 10 to the 6th, 10 to the negative 6th. A milli is 10 to the negative 3rd. So there are 1,000 microliters in a milliliter. How many millimeters in a centimeter? In a meter. So a centimeter is 10 to the minus 2, whereas a a millimeter is 10 to the minus 3, whereas a centimeter is 10 to the minus 2. Okay, so that means that a millimeter is 1/10 of a centimeter. So there are 10 millimeters in a centimeter. A meter has no exponential. It's 10 to the 0. Okay, so knowing that a centimeter is 10 to the minus 2, you know that there must be 100, so 10 to 10 squared centimeters in a meter. Okay, so these are the different prefixes. How many grams in a kilo? Okay, so a kilo is 1,000, an exponential of 1,000, and a gram is just one gram. So there are 1,000 grams in a kilogram. How many milligrams, mg, are there in a gram? So it's the exponential is 10 to the minus 3. So there are 1,000 milligrams in a gram. Okay. Find a good mnemonic that works for you. Here's an example. Good models know how Dunkin' Donuts can make you not petite. Giga, mega, kilo, hecto, deca, deci, centi, milli, micro, nano, pico. In biology, we generally are dealing with very small things, so we generally look at, well, at least I do. I'm a molecular biologist, so I generally deal with kilo and less. Okay, so I'm dealing with centi, milli, micro, nano, pico. So it's very important to know what the centi, milli, micro, nano measurements are. You can remember pico if you want, but that's the important part. Centi, milli, micro, nano. Okay? Thursday, we're going to talk about enzymes and how biology cheats at thermodynamics. We will have our exam on the lab exam on Thursday. I will get you the labs that you handed in class on Thursday, so you at least have a little bit of time to look over them. If there are any questions, please let me know. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in to Max yammers at you for a while on YouTube. If you have any questions about this or any clarifications, please let me know. But it's been fun talking to you.